Test. Oh yeah, looks like I'm good. Okay. I'm Phil Wyman, and this is the Wild Theology Podcast, where the world, the humans in it, and God are all wilder than we've been told.
That's your intro.
So, you'll get philosophy and theology and crazy stories that come from 30 years of pastoring,
Boring.
20 years of festival work,
Whatever.
and the mud and blood of wrestling with the living in spaces angels fear to tread.
Ooh, trying to sound interesting, are we?
Oh.
Yeah, you think you got something to say?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the problem, dimwit.
Look, I'm a lot smarter than you think.
Yeah, you tightened your shoes this morning.
Whatever. We're Phil Wyman, and this is Wild Theology, where you get to argue with your own ideas.
And lose.
That's the point. You can help support this podcast, as well as my ongoing creative endeavors, if that's something you would like to do, by joining me here on Patreon. By pledging support, you will only be charged by the episode, whether it's a podcast or a preview into one of the many books I'm in the process of writing. In this Wild Theology podcast, we'll look at the subject of Halloween again. Last time, I challenged us to consider what we've been told about the history of this celebration, which has now become, by some measurements, the second largest holiday on the American calendar. In this podcast episode, we're going to look into one of the most controversial elements of the holiday, witches, and what modern witches do on Halloween. Before we can talk about what witches do, we need to define what we mean by the word witch. The word witch conjures up visions of the Wizard of Oz, with both good and evil witches, Glenda in her white sparkly gown and gentle kindness, and the cackling wicked witch of the West with her green face and hooked nose. It also brings to mind the more recent Hollywood renditions of witches. Samantha Stevens from the once popular TV show Bewitched, which ran for 8 seasons from 1964 to 1972, Bette Midler as Winifred Sanderson in Hocus Pocus, and of course Harry Potter has filled our minds with images of Hermione Granger and the rest of the female cast of powerful magic makers. But these are not the witches we're talking about. There are real people across the world who self-identify as witches. In fact, Neo-Paganism, which is the classification of religion witchcraft is filed under, is one of the fastest growing religious movements in our time. Wicca, a word familiar to many people today, is simply a subclassification of witchcraft. It is these people, self-identifying as neo-pagan occult practitioners, that we are referring to in this episode. This is, after all, the very people Christians have accused of casting malevolent spells and sacrificing kitty cats and even human beings during their high holy day of Halloween. Neo-paganism has its beginnings in the late 1940s or early 1950s in the UK, with the rise of Wicca through witchcraft leaders Gerald Gardner and Alex Sanders. This is why we refer to it as, quote, neo-paganism. Witchcraft, as we know it today, is comprised of a variety of traditions. In the same way that Christianity is a name for a host of denominations with different practices and variations on beliefs, paganism is an umbrella term for a number of religious beliefs and practices. The largest group is called Wicca, followed by a number of other traditions from Celtic, Nordic, Italian, Egyptian, and other ethnic varieties. These different expressions of paganism and witchcraft are typically framed by the god and goddess systems of ancient pagan cultures. Unfortunately, describing a neo-pagan or a witch is not an easy thing to do. The emphasis on personal experience and religion as self-discovery allows a person to describe their religion for themselves. Consequently, the largest category of witch, or pagan, is the solitary practitioner, who has found their influence, guidance, and training in books, online engagement, and festival settings. Now, there are a few factors which can be identified as typical neo-pagan commonalities. First is the emphasis on nature. Neo-pagans typically hold a panentheistic view of God and nature. God is all and is in all creation. Thus, paganism has been called a green religion. Second, magic is believed to be a source of transformational power to do good or harm. Magic is typically seen as an ability to tap into a divine power of the universe, and unlike the answer to a prayer in the Christian tradition, is something we ourselves make happen by force of will and practice of spellcasting. Third, the pagan deity structures of ancient civilizations form the myths of today's paganism. In this sense, witches and neo-pagans often identify themselves as followers of the old ways, in distinction to people in the New Age movement. Fourth, neo-pagans tend toward an affinity with liturgy. In comparison with Christianity, they would be more likely to be comfortable with high church traditions than with evangelicalism in its low liturgical format. A witch or neo-pagan might identify with all four of these elements, or simply one or two of them. As you can see, what defines a witch or a neo-pagan can be difficult to specifically pin down, and identifying a witch may not be as easy as you think. They may look like your neighbor, or your neighbor's kid, or even your neighbor's mom or dad, because a witch can be either male or female. Along with the green spirituality, the magic, the pagan deities, and the rituals, many pagans follow a cycle or wheel of the year. This wheel traditionally has 8 high holy days or Sabbats. The solstices and the equinoxes are 4 of those days, and in between each of them is another day: Imbolc, Beltane, Lammas, and Samhain. Halloween, or Samhain in Irish and Noson Galangaeaf in Welsh, is typically considered to be the most important of these 8 Sabbats. The importance of Samhain on the neo-pagan calendar is a significant factor in the creation of so many urban myths surrounding witches and Halloween. So we ask the question, what do witches do on Halloween? Samhain, the Irish Gaelic name for the 31st of October, is typically identified with the dead. As we saw in the last episode, today's Halloween rose out of the Christian traditions of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, so the name refers to a hallowed or holy evening. Neo-paganism and modern witchcraft developed its wheel of the year at a significantly later date than the Christian holy days were formed. Yet the identification with Samhain and the dead is no coincidence. The influence of Christian focus on saints and souls has become part of the celebration of the neo-pagan Samhain as well. On this day, many witches believe that the veil between the worlds is thinnest. This refers to the visible realm and the invisible realm where non-corporeal spirits reside, particularly those who have passed on from this life into whatever there is after death, and somehow these worlds collide. Now, sources such as Charisma News, or the sensationalized teachings of Bill Schnoenbellen, give us examples of the wide scope of exaggeration and presumption about the history of the ancient Celtic calendar and its supposed connection to Halloween. Like conspiracy theorists, they've pulled together a broad range of resourceful but loosely connected evidences to try and show that Halloween is attached to both ancient and ongoing occult evil. For the most part, witches are simply regular people who have adopted an alternative form of spirituality. Many of them have had spiritual experiences through their lives, which traditional religion could not interpret. Others were interested in an adventurous side of religion that emphasized magic and the supernatural. Some were rejected or abused by traditional religion and found solace and acceptance in the neo-pagan community. As a pastor from Salem, Massachusetts, and someone who has hundreds of friends and acquaintances who identify themselves as neo-pagans, I have some experience with what witches do on Halloween. I've talked to them. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've been with them on Halloween when they held dumb suppers, which is eating a meal without speaking, in honor of the silent people who have passed on before us. I have seen their witches' balls that simply look like a witchy version of a masquerade ball. I've seen their circle gatherings and how they call upon the four directions of the wind to ask for the power of the spirits on earth to bring peace to the world, healing to people and comfort to those whose loved ones have passed on. Yes, sometimes necromancy is practiced and the attempt to communicate with the dead. And yes, this is something Christians are told in scriptures not to practice. But this is a far cry from sacrificing black cats or infants or calling curses down upon the churches. Most people simply want to light candles and sit silently in hope of hearing from their relatives who have passed on to the other side. Selena Fox, a prolific pagan author and noted witch, suggests a number of things witches can do on Samhain. And strangely, none of it includes cursing or killing or some kind of weird sex magic. Instead, it involves things like nature walks, eating together, reflection, and perhaps personal divination like the use of tarot cards and astrology. Yes, once again, there are things that Christians should not do on this list, but it falls far short of the evil we have been told runs rampant on this night. This is not to say that malevolent and violent things do not happen under the umbrella of neo-paganism or in the name of witchcraft. Sometimes bad things do occur. But before we point our fingers, all we have to do is remember the abuse of children at the hands of priests, or the propagation of prejudice and violence in the name of God. That should cause us to understand that there are bad apples in every religious barrel. Remembering that is the beginning of being able to share an honest gospel to a questioning and sometimes challenging world. Remember, what you say about people and their practices needs to be true. Sensationalism about anybody is nothing but gossip and slander. Such things should never come from the mouths of Christians. We've denigrated a group of people who practice a spirituality far different from our own, but that extreme difference is not grounds enough to continue speaking lies about them. The Christian church has much to repent for, and one of those things is how we describe the pagan community, especially around Halloween. A PDF of this podcast, which you can download, is attached to the Patreon page. If you enjoyed this episode, and you'd like to find out more about how Christians might be able to rethink their engagement with this popular holiday, you can discover more in my new book, The Reformation of Halloween, at Amazon.com, or in my anthropology of American Neo-Paganism, called Witches Are Real People Too. Thanks. Thank you to David Gerard for his ambient music. What you heard today was 12:48 a.m. Black Rock, and you can find more of his music at bandcamp.ambientism.com. If you'd like to support this project, you can do so here on Patreon for as little as $1 a release, and at the most, that's $4 a month.
Why on earth would anybody want to support us?
Well, I think we're pretty cool, and maybe some people believe in what we're doing.
Oh, come on, you believe that?
Yeah.
Don't you ever think you're just a little too weird for the average person?
Yeah, sometimes.